Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. Today, we're discussing the somber two-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, which occurred on Saturday this weekend. But going 2 years back, when Russian troops sort of formally begun the invasion of Ukraine, that came 8 years after the illegal annexation of Crimea. And so many say the war has really been going on for the better part of 10 years now. Brunello, could you sort of start us off by, providing some background and some context as to what the key events were that led up to this invasion, and how we got to the point where we are now, 2 years in?
Absolutely. So, as you correctly pointed out, the entire story started, well, many years ago for sure. And we remember the Orange Revolution. But even if we want to focus on the events of the real last 10 years, 2014 annexation of Crimea. So, this is when events really start becoming war type rather than revolt, revolutions, or something, or interference in elections. 2014, Crimea get annexed by Russia, who promotes a referendum that was highly manipulated and prove the annexation. Clearly, that was never recognized by virtually no country in the world. However, it remains unresolved. The problem was that the West did absolutely nothing for those 10 years. And so when on 24th February 2022, Russia invaded the rest of Ukraine, we seem like unprepared. It's like, what's going on? Instead, there was something that has been boiling um, for years now. Uh, Russia was surprised by how things went because they were hoping for a sort of German type blitzkrieg, get into Kiev, get Kiev, um, remove the government, eliminating most likely Zelensky, get the eastern and southern part of Ukraine under Russian control and establish that form of control and finish the job within weeks, if not months. None of it happened. They did try to get to Kiev, but we all remember the long queues of tanks. They were as long as 70 kilometers, which by any military strategies today will look like an absolute obsolete way of conducting the war, risky itself, because if there were to be um, uh, an army ready to react, you would not expose 70 kilometers of tanks to any airstrike. So Russia clearly also came somehow unprepared. And we know that from the reports of that time that the aviation wasn't sure what the Navy was doing, it wasn't well coordinated with the army on the ground. So, it was as messy as one can imagine. And I would say thank God, in the sense that that helped Ukraine organize a resistance a bit earlier than Russia would have ever expected, and stronger than Russia would expect, and also because the West quite quickly unified in the support, at least at the beginning, of the support of Ukraine. Just to finish this first part of the story, how did we uh, uh, how did we continue? Effectively, Russia established a strong presence in the southern east part of Ukraine, the one that remained under its control after it was kicked out of Kiev in the more eastern regions. And so the four provinces of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson were annexed again to the Russian Federation once again by making use of civilly manipulated referenda. And this is where we are at the moment. Ukraine tried the counteroffensive in spring, summer, and the beginning of autumn 2023. It wasn't as successful as they thought, and now we are in sort of stalemate since November. Now, Doors are open. What will happen is yet to be seen.
I mean, it seems like the point that the war is in right now is effectively a war of attrition of, whose military industrial complex is bigger and better. And certainly the Russian one, seems to somehow keep replenishing despite sort of the massive sanctions put upon it by the Western countries. And what's really key for Ukraine then is Western support. So tell me more about that. How has Western support evolved over the last 2 years? Where is the United States and its European allies at right now, and what could the future of that look like for the rest of this year?
Sure. So the support has been massive. The biggest donors have been the US, the EU, and within the EU, especially Germany, and in Europe outside of the EU, UK. And we are talking about several hundred billions of dollars in total. The US itself was 74 billions, the EU 82 billion euros in overall aid. The US more focused on weapons, the EU more focused on financial aid, and the UK alone has pledged 12 billion pounds, of which more than 7 in military aid alone. The EU has recently approved the 50 billion reliable financial support package for Ukraine. And what they mean by reliable is that this money that is pledged and is destined to arrive sooner rather than later. Although there is a bit of a discrepancy between what the EU has pledged and what they have actually delivered. They have pledged 144 billions, but they've only delivered 77. So the EU is definitely at the forefront, and within it, Germany, with more than 20 billion aid approved. And we know that Germany had to approve its own 100 billion military rebuilding package beginning of the crisis. We know that Germany, for historical reasons, didn't have effectively an army. Well, we said many times the invasion of Ukraine represents the end of the post-World War II equilibria. The fact that Germany was allowed and actually encouraged to rearm means that we are really in a post-World War II world, because it is clear that one of the consequences of the two world wars of the 20th century was that Germany would not have its own strong military presence. And so this is clearly past this time, and we are actually now asking Germany to step up its support.
I mean, the real question then is, where do we go from here? Because in theory, the stalemate could last for a significant amount of time. But the sort of national momentum on the Ukrainian side is waning. Russia still controls something close to 20% of Ukrainian territory. What does the future look like, particularly as well in the context of the American elections?
Yeah, so in theory, with the stalemate as we have it now, because as we said, the Russians have been pushed back into the southern eastern regions, but there have retrenched and then further entrenched their position. So very hard to kick them out of there. But honestly, any attempt to go more toward Kiev has been pushed back. Try the attempts to get to Odessa and with it eventually Transnistria also has not really worked. So Russia is very well entrenched in these four provinces that I mentioned before. And they represent around 17-18% of the Ukrainian territory. On the other hand, Ukraine has tried its counteroffensives, but we said didn't really work. Actually, recently, the key city of Avdiivka was conquered by Russia. So, if anything, it seems like Ukraine, without as much military support from the US that has been approved in the Senate, but needs to be approved by the House of Representatives, so it's actually stuck at the moment. Without that aid, Ukraine cannot do much. In this situation of stalemate, then people say, why don't we have an agreement? Well, in theory, the first thing to do should have a agree on a ceasefire. Would they be able to do so? One hopes, but ceasefires are just, meant to be broken at some point by either side. So it can only be a temporary solution. A more permanent solution would be one in which both sides have something to lose. And so it would be painful. And a potential equilibrium could be that Ukraine gives up the territory that, at least in practice, not even in the euro, so to speak, they give up the territory that they've lost very hard to win back. In exchange for that, they have immediate access to NATO. So Russia, which is the biggest fear that Ukraine has no incentive to restart the war 6 months from now, 1 year from now, 2 years from now, right? Because once Ukraine is part of NATO, then is really no-go area, because otherwise it would force the retaliation of other countries. So Ukraine loses part of its territory. Horrible to think, but this is already the reality on the ground. Russia loses the reason for its invasion, which was not having to border with NATO countries. Instead, we know that this is already a lost cause because apart from the Baltics, now also Sweden is becoming part of NATO and may soon Finland do the same, which means that then eventually Russia will have to face a much bigger border with NATO. So the reason for the war has already been lost, and it will be further lost by Russia if Ukraine were to be admitted. Is this equilibrium possible? It's possible in theory, it's hard in practice. You can convince Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians without the foreign support will not be able to continue fighting. So as painful is for them to accept what has happened, they may be convinced. Much harder is to convince Putin. And in fact, here is the biggest problem. Putin has an option value waiting. Why should he sign anything if 6 months from now, Trump gets elected again in the White House? And 1 year from now, he's the president of the US, who, as he already said, will solve the Ukrainian war in one night, which we all know means that it will allow Putin to do whatever he wants with Ukraine. Considering that he has already said that Russia is encouraged to do what the hell they want, that was the expression used by Trump, with European countries that don't pay the 2% NATO of GDP NATO contribution. So, there's no reason for Putin to sign anything just yet. Wait, make further progress in Ukraine, see what happens in November, and potentially 1 year from now, situation might be much more favorable to him than it is now, which means that unfortunately it seems like the war is likely to last at least another year before we can get to any sort of resolution.
And that is, of course, not even factoring in what Russia might do, whether they make significant, gains in Ukraine, bolstered by possibly a Trump presidency, the sort of risk that poses broadly to Europe and the other kind of neighboring EU and NATO Baltic states. So, clearly that'll be an area of major geopolitical instability, no matter where the election goes for the rest of the year, and something we'll have to watch closely. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.